Everyone. Hope you had a good lunch. So now we're going to move on to the futures market. So we've gone through the concept of the interest rate spread, the bid-offer spread. Interest is a market phenomenon, so consequently it has a bid-offer, a spread. And we went through how the floor and the ceiling are set. And as a re-emphasis, this was discovered by Professor Fekete, and hugely in understanding, in the completion of the theory of interest. So now we're going to be looking at a variation on that to do with the futures market. Now, the futures market is also a market phenomenon as well. And a futures contract, just in case anyone's unsure, allows one to establish the price of the purchase or sale of a good now for delivery at a set date in the future. And does anyone know where the first futures contracts developed? Japan for the rice futures, and they've been rice futures in Japan since the early 18th century. So there's a very long history of there being a futures market, and it evolved spontaneously. The futures market evolved spontaneously. And it was to satisfy, obviously, the needs of producers and consumers of that good in question. And it was a remarkable achievement of human coordination as well. There's no question about that. Right, so whenever I'm talking from now on, I'm talking about examples that are under the backdrop of a real gold standard. So I'm not talking about the regime that we're in at the moment. So the relationship, so you have, to doubly emphasize, you have the spot market for a good, and you have a futures market. Now, there may be a relationship between the two. So for let's say the spot copper market and the 3-month copper future, there might be a relationship between the two. There might not. And we're going to go into the exact mechanics about when there is a relationship and when there isn't a relationship. So the futures market and the spot market are closely linked by the ability to warehouse the good in question. Okay? So if you can warehouse the good, then there will be a rigid relationship between the spot and the futures market. If you can't warehouse the good, then there is no necessary relationship between the futures and the spot market. Now,
could you give an example?
I will. When I pick up analysts' reports from, let's say, Goldman Sachs, and they are looking for the market expectation of the future price of gold, they will plug in the futures curve after the current spot price to say this is what the market thinks the gold price will be in the future. Now, that is a mistake, and it's a very common mistake. It's not only Goldman Sachs that do it; everyone does it. effectively, before I elaborate on that, you have to think about the following. How often does the placing of bets on the outcome of a football match influence the football match? You know, it should never be the case that the market for the bets on the outcome of the football match influence the football match.
In a non-rigged market.
In a non-rigged market, yeah. So normally, there is no relationship between an event and a bet on the event. Okay? But if you can warehouse the good in question, there will be a relationship because there's arbitrage that can be done. Now, for an example, for a good, so futures markets, it's correct to say that a futures market is giving what the market thinks the future price will be if there's no ability to warehouse the good in question. Now, an example of that is the market for euro-dollars. So the euro-dollar market is a futures market where buyers and sellers meet to determine the short-term interest rate at various periods in the future. All the way, you get maturities all the way up to 2015, 2016. Now, if you look at one of these interest rate future contracts, they're given so if the market thinks the interest rate is going to be 3%, the way that the future will be quoted is 100 minus 3, which is 97. So let me write that down. So let's say you have 2012, 2013, 2014, 2015, and it goes 98, 99, 99 and a half, 99 and 3/4. So the market thinks that the short-term interest rate in 2012 will be 2%, 1%, 0.5%, 0.25%, 100 minus that. That's just the way they quote it. I don't know why. So, do you think there is any way to hedge that contract? There's no way to hedge someone writing this futures contract. There is no cash market for the short-term interest rate in 5 years' time. There's no ability to warehouse the underlying asset or the underlying result of what this futures market is saying. And another example where the futures market does give what the market thinks the future price will be is the volatility market, so VIX. So yes, Goldman Sachs and the like are right, but gold and certain other goods, many other goods, which you can warehouse, it doesn't mean that at all. There is an arbitrage relationship which will be exploited that means that the futures price will be related somehow to the spot price. So the two things to consider are, when you're thinking about a futures market, can one warehouse the good in question that underlies this futures market? And the subsidiary question to that is the existence of a lending market for that good in question. Okay? So, obviously one can warehouse gold. No, warehoused. And, well, forget gold. Let's say copper. Okay? One can warehouse copper. You can buy copper, put it in a warehouse. the existence of a lending market for the good in question. So that means, can one borrow copper? Can one lend copper? Well, you can. There is there's a market for the leasing of copper. I can call up a broker and he will lend me copper on a particular interest rate basis, and I can borrow copper itself. So the ability to warehouse and to the existence of lending markets. Okay, so these are the two things which you must consider when you're considering futures markets. Now, should one and two exist, the market rate of interest will be involved in the relationship between the futures and the spot market. The market rate of gold interest, remember I'm speaking on everything under a gold standard, as well as the market rate for the loan on the good itself. So these two things will influence the relationship between the spot and the futures market. And I'll explain how later on. So the market rate for the loan on the good, copper, it's not normally denominated in terms of the good itself. You don't pay back a copper loan in X, the principal plus a certain amount of copper. Okay? The market rate for that loan is usually expressed in terms of the gold interest rate. So that's an important thing to grasp. Okay? So we'll go through an example now. Very simple example. One where the ability to warehouse exists, but there is no lending market for the good in question. And so an example of that would be a local apple market. So apples are harvested, let's say, once a year, towards the end of July. And apples can be stored without rotting for 6 months. So people naturally want to eat apples at any time of the year, just not merely when they're in season. So the desired apple consumption, if you can have them, remains pretty much constant throughout the year. Now, should a local futures market for apples develop for some reason, then an arbitrage-based relationship between this market and the market for immediate apples, or cash apples, spot apples, will occur. And the prevailing rate of interest will have a say in that arbitrage relationship that develops. So it would be good just to talk about the distinction in the nature between apples and copper. Apples have a periodic production. Copper doesn't have a periodic production. There is no periodicity in the production of copper. Okay? So apples are perishable. And apples are perishable, yeah. And apples are perishable is another difference. So the production of apples follows periodic patterns. So during harvest season, there are plenty of apples for sale from the farmer. And the farmer can sell either directly to the market at that time or to the warehouseman. Now, the warehouseman in this case is the person that's been granted the duty of storing apples for consumption throughout the year. So outside of harvest season, the farmer has no apples to sell. obviously. So if you want apples outside of season, you'll have to go to the warehouseman to get it. So depending on where the autumn apple future is, let's say, that will influence where the warehouseman will bid for the farmer's apples. And what the warehouseman will do is he will buy the farmer's apples as they're coming onto the market and sell the autumn future. And the spread between the price of the farmer's apples and the autumn future falls. Okay? So what we have is apple production, which looks something like this, say. And latent demand for the consumption of apples, that looks like. This is where another pen would be useful. That's, you can't all see that, but that's what it's meant to be representing. You haven't been handed this out yet. Okay, so this represents the production, and this represents the latent apple demand.
So these peaks are 1 year apart.
1 year apart. So when the warehouseman buys apples, spot apples, if he's buying spot apples, he buys at what price? The bid or the ask?
Yes.
Ask. And he sells the autumn future, it will be at the bid of the bid of future. Okay?
Actually, I'm not aware that the existing studies or handbooks on future trading recognize this.
Really?
I mean, you are the first one and only one, as far as I'm concerned,
Okay.
who brings manga into futures trading.
Well,
And I'm quite sure this is a very, very important step, which has been missing up to now, and I think you are path-breaking here.
thanks, Professor.
No, I have to say that because you may not realize. I mean, I've been watching the future markets for 40 years and bought all the books and promotional material from brokerages, and I have never seen any reference to the bid on that. So I have to give you, I have to commend you. This is a great achievement.
I can say I've tried to talk to my broker about putting on some of these trades, and he doesn't really understand what I'm trying to do, even when I describe it to him.
Oh dear.
So,
They're not even interested.
no.
They just want your commission.
And they also think the spot market means the near future.
But this again is all under the assumption we're in the gold standard era.
Yes.
And yet we're not. We have regular.
I know that's not relevant.
Why your broker is not wrong either.
Okay. So he buys spot apples at the ask and sells autumn futures at the bid. Okay? And that, the difference is defined as the basis. So apple future bid minus spot apple ask. Okay? That is defined as the basis. Now, when you annualize this, it's called the carry.
Annualize what?
When you annualize the basis, you get something called the carry.
It's a percentage growth.
Percentage growth. Because this will be, let's say,
Or in case it could be a percentage drop.
yeah.
How do we annualize?
How do I annualize? I'll tell you that later.
Okay.
That's not relevant just
Could be
now.
positive, could be negative.
Yeah, it could be positive or negative.
And could be rising or falling.
Absolutely. Okay? But just remember this definition here. Make a note of it. So what happens is that when the farmer buys these apples and sells the future, the carry falls. He contracts that spread, that premium, by the mere fact that he's doing it. And the carry falls. So carry falls. I've got this pen here. I don't know whether it will make it worse or better.
What is the reason why you have to distinguish between basis and carry?
Just because this could be this will be an irregular time period. So if you want to compare apples with apples, you have to annualize it. That's the only difference.
Present apple and future.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to look at, let's say, the basis on apples versus the basis on oranges, apple futures might be every January, March, May. Orange futures might be every month in between those. So if you want to compare them like for like, you can't just take the difference between the future and the spot and just look at them side by side. You have to look at it on an apples for apples basis, or oranges for oranges basis, which is why you have to annualize it. Okay? Is that clear?
It's not to me. Can I ask a question at this point? Does that mean that if you have something like copper, which is produced regularly throughout the year, that you actually don't need to quote a carry? It's irrelevant?
No, you do, because the futures contracts are only every sort of 3 months or so. Yeah. I mean, obviously, spot copper is available at any time you want, hopefully.
Thank you.
So that's the reason. Don't get worried too much about the difference between basis and carry. Just remember that the carry basis references the bid on the future and the ask on the ask on the spot. Okay?
The warehouseman watches the basis. So when does he get the incentive to add to his stocks? Could you just...
You see, the warehouseman is most likely to get a premium for doing this when the production is at its maximum. Because when the production is at its maximum, there's likely to be a depressed spot market, cash market. So he looks at what the bid on the next futures contract is, and he says, right, I want this minimum return, so this is where my bid is for for cash apples now. And he is likely to get his largest return from doing this when the season is at its peak, when you're getting loads and loads of apples onto the apple market. And after harvest season, the carry falls as he's doing this. Okay? So it's now out of season, say. And when the farmer sells apples in storage at the warehouse and buys back any futures against it, he references something else. Okay? And what he references, so just to summarize, at this moment the apple warehouseman has bought apples and sold apple futures. And for that he references the basis. So now it comes time to unwind that. Okay? And he references the something called the Cobasis. So now it's out of season, and let's say it's in the middle of winter, and he wants to, there's big apple demand. So he wants to unwind all of this, all of the apples that he's stored. So he looks at the bid on apples, spot apples. What are people willing to pay for spot apples? And he references the ask on the futures. Okay? And the reason he does that is because if he's selling apples to whoever, as he sells apples, he needs to unwind the futures position he had in the first place. Now, it's probably slightly belated, but why does the warehouseman, when he's buying apples, why would he want to sell futures against it?
To hedge his market risk.
Okay, so that's the reason he sells futures against buying apples. It's to hedge his price risk on apples. So he's only earning a very narrow spread, a very, very narrow spread, as you would expect, because warehousing is not a intellectually challenging activity. Okay. So the bid on spot apples minus the ask of the futures, the future is defined as the Cobasis. And when you annualize this, you get the D carry. Okay?
And this is what is not known in the trade presently. These both concepts are new, the Cobasis and the D carry.
Yeah.
Which is really amazing, that with all that history of future trading, They did not come to the point that they refined the studies to that level. It's really amazing.
The basis was known? The theory about the basis was known, or is it?
Yeah.
And only the Cobasis is new, or both are new?
Well, no, neither was known. They just look at the difference between the futures price and the spot price.
Okay.
They don't think.
That's the standard